Okay, and we're live. All right, welcome everybody. This is the Real Crusades History Podcast. We're doing this a little bit differently than we did last time. We're actually just going to go live. We just released the first episode for this new series yesterday, and now everybody's going to get to hear the second episode the next day. I think that's kind of a record for us. So, this is the first Crusade podcast series, and we are now entering into episode number 2. The topic for this evening is going to be Constantinople to Dorylaeum. We're going to take a look at the Latin armies as they enter into Constantinople and interact with the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus, the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, and of course the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097. So this is going to be an interesting episode. Let me go ahead and introduce everybody that's going to be with us this evening. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm joined, of course, by Rand Brown. Rand, how are you doing?
Awesome. Glad to be back.
Excellent. And we've got Scott Amos with us. Scott, how are you?
Doing fine, Stephen. Glad to be here tonight.
Great. And our academic guest, as last time, is going to be Dr. William Hamblin, medieval historian and military historian in particular. Dr. Hamblin, how you doing?
Great.
Thanks for being back with us. We are glad to have you here. So we're going to take a look at the continuation of what is known as the Prince's Crusade. That is the Crusade proper.
I'm doing good. Thanks.
Oh, good. We had a little bit of a delay there, I think.
Yeah, I think I was getting anyway, I think it's fixed.
Okay, good. Excellent. So we're jumping into the Prince's Crusade. Last time we did a little bit of an overview of the People's Crusade. So what we're going to talk about right now is the main armies of the First Crusade that set out with the blessing of Pope Urban II. And we reviewed those armies a little bit last time. The first group to get going was Hugh of Vermandois, who set out well before some of the others, and he was followed by Godfrey of Bouillon and the army of the Duchy of Lorraine, which was then followed by the Italian Normans under Bohemond of Taranto, and finally, the final group was going to be the group from the Provençal group from southern France under Raymond IV of Toulouse. So we're going to look at that and look at the progress of those armies. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Hamblin. Do you want to talk a little bit about the arrival at Constantinople and what happened when the crusading armies got to Constantinople?
Well, the armies arrived in kind of spaced out because each was going a different direction, and each had a different time that it took them to get there. So they didn't arrive all together. And in fact, before the princely crusaders arrived, there had been a couple groups of the People's Crusade that were already there, and they basically crossed over into Turkey or Anatolia about a month before Hugh arrived. So it's really kind of like a stream or a steady flow of crusaders coming at different times and from different directions. When they got to Constantinople, they faced a number of problems. The first was the problem of supply. And that has basically been a problem for the Crusaders since they started out, and it would be a problem until they got to Jerusalem, and probably got worse as time progressed. And when they got to Constantinople, some of them started stealing, basically. Plundering was the major way that medieval armies fed themselves. And although the leaders said don't plunder, for the most part, occasionally they let them plunder, but for the most part they said don't. If you're hungry and you're a poor infantryman and have no food, and there's no food in the camp, you go out and look for something. If you don't have enough money, you might steal some. So you started getting tension arising between the Byzantines, who basically wanted to help the Crusaders, but on the other hand were afraid of the Crusaders, and then the Crusaders themselves. The second problem that occurred was Alexius didn't want the Crusaders inside Constantinople. Now, you can understand why he didn't want that, because number one, there could be riots and fights and problems in the city. Number two, for example, some of the People's Crusade had stolen lead from the roof of a church to sell it on the market and get some money to buy food. So you'd have that type of problem going on. But more specifically, the problem was that Bohemond's group in particular, the Normans, but other groups in potentially, were looking to take over Byzantine territory. And Bohemond had attacked the Byzantine Empire on several occasions, and to let him into Constantinople with an army was a potential military disaster. So they let the Crusaders in, but only a few at a time, and they had the markets outside the city. So basically they have tourist groups that could go in, pray at the churches, see the city, and then they'd have to leave. The third big problem that arose was the question of leadership and purpose. And basically, Alexius wanted what he had wanted when he asked for the crusade was mercenaries. What he got was these giant armies under independent commanders. And so in order to control the crusade, Alexius tried to get the lords, the princes, to take oaths to him as they would oaths to a feudal lord, and to promise to return to Alexius all territory, all cities that had been part of the Byzantine Empire, which technically included Jerusalem, although Jerusalem hadn't been part of the empire for centuries. It did include Antioch, which just a decade or so before the Crusaders come, was in Byzantine hands, and all of Anatolia, all of modern Turkey was in Byzantine hands. So you get a lot of tension arising, and a lot of the Crusaders distrusting the Byzantines and thinking that Alexius is plotting against them. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of distrust, and then some types of actual, feuding that goes on as they're at Constantinople.
Yeah, and I think, if we look at somebody like Godfrey of Bouillon, for example, Albert of Aachen gives us a pretty good account of Godfrey's arrival at Constantinople and maybe what was going on in his mind. Is somebody like opening?
I just had a water bottle probably cracked. Sorry.
That's okay. So Godfrey of Bouillon, when he gets to Constantinople, Alexius, one of the first things Alexius wants is for Godfrey to, like you're saying, Dr. Hamblin, to come into Constantinople and meet with him because he wants to get that oath from Godfrey. Godfrey is a little bit hesitant to do that because he has heard rumors on his way to Constantinople that the emperor had been holding, for example, Hugh of Vermandois hostage. And Godfrey doesn't know what's going to happen if he just, walks into Alexius's power, just walks into Constantinople without the protection of his men. It would just be, Godfrey and a few of his men. So Alexius and Godfrey kind of pass embassies almost back and forth for a while. Godfrey's not really willing to just, walk right into Constantinople and meet with the emperor. The emperor isn't willing to let Godfrey just ferry across the Bosphorus without meeting with him because he wants to get that oath of loyalty from Godfrey. Because at first what Godfrey asks is he just asks to be let across the Bosphorus without really even meeting with Alexius. Mm-hmm. And what ends up happening, of course, is that Godfrey gets some hostages from Alexius, like some members of Alexius's family. And that at that point, Godfrey is willing to go into Constantinople and meet with the emperor. So we can see kind of like where there's sort of a rational caution on both sides. Neither side knows exactly what they're dealing with. Both sides do want to cooperate with one another to an extent. a lot of the noble leaders are very willing to take this oath to Alexius, like the Northern French, especially, like guys like Stephen of Blois, Robert Curthose of Normandy. There doesn't seem to have been any issue for them with taking this oath of loyalty. I know Albert of Aachen mentions that Godfrey, for example, is uncomfortable with it just because he had been a vassal to the Holy Roman Emperor. So anyway, Rand, did you want to comment on this, or did you have something else to say, Dr. Hamblin?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, it was interesting. You know, one of the things I always find fascinating about this whole phase of the Crusade is, you know, a lot of what they were experiencing, a lot of what the princes were you know, what the Lord's Crusade was experiencing on its way up to Constantinople was sort of a direct result of the passage of the People's Crusade just a year prior. You know, a lot of the difficulties they faced were from the same people that, you know, had initially probably would have had a much warmer welcome in some of those places they passed through, had the People's Crusade not passed through there first, and you know, caused the issues due to their undiscipline, you know, due to their lack of discipline and things like that. And I think it was kind of one of those situations where they were already walking into a place that was, you know, where everybody was kind of already very suspicious of them. You know, and they didn't, you know, the common people didn't have the, you know, they didn't have the wherewithal to distinguish between, you know, these much more professionally led armies and the, you know, basically the undisciplined mob that had been the People's Crusade that had passed through, you know, just prior to them. Also with Alexius, I think one of the it's a great scene in the whole scheme of the First Crusade, but you know, the tension between Bohemond and Alexius. You know, there's people don't realize just how much personal history there was, you know, between those two. You know, here, you know, just a few, you know, just a few years prior, in I want to say it was 10. When was
the 1080s, right? Sometime in the 1080s.
Yeah, in the 1080s.
Yeah.
You know, so just not a decade before, Bohemond and Alexius had faced each other on the battlefield at Dorylaeum, and you know, Alexius barely fled the battle alive. With, you know, allegedly, according to Norman records, he had 3 Norman lance points sticking out of his armor. You know, I mean, this is a very, very tense relationship.
And what's interesting about Bohemond too is when he shows up, he's all honeyed words, right? According to Anna Komnene, he shows up, he's got no problem swearing an oath of loyalty to Alexius.
He does. He does.
Yeah.
Yeah. He does, with the exception that you could definitely tell that he was searching for any way possible that he could, that he wouldn't have to do that. And it's funny to watch. It's funny to read about the, you know, he shows up and he you know, he tries to, you could tell that there was probably an effort to see if there was some way he could bypass Constantinople. You know, and there was, you know, even when he shows up, you know, he sends his nephew Tancred, you know, or his cousin Tancred in first, you know, and before he goes, and you kind of see this little like cat and mouse thing go on.
And he asks Alexius for a Byzantine military title. Basically, he has to be made domestic of the East, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
which is really interesting.
There's this very interesting sort of diplomatic tete-a-tete that goes on between the two, and it goes to highlight the tension that exists between them. And it you know, although Anna Komnene definitely gives us a good idea in the Alexiad, it would have been interesting to just be a fly on the wall, you know, with that kind of meeting, because it just, you could probably cut the tension in the air with a knife. You know?
Yeah.
I think another thing we need to note is the importance of these oaths for medieval people. This was a fundamental way that they interacted with each other in the church, and in fact with God, taking vows and oaths and so forth. You did that with God. This was very serious. It's not like modern politicians who, take an oath when they talk to Congress and then they just lie. It's meaningless. But for them, it was very important. And there's another problem of overlapping loyalties. That is to say, if you were from France, you might have a lord you've already made a vassalage vow to in France, maybe the King of France or someone else. You come to Constantinople. Are you able to now make another oath to Alexius that doesn't break your previous oath? Or with Emperor Henry or whomever? And I think a final aspect of the oath taking is that those who took it quick probably didn't believe in it as much as those who waited and struggled with the issue. That is, if you didn't care about the oath, oh, sure, I'll take an oath. Off you go, and you just ignore it. But the guys who were more serious about their oaths probably took longer to think it through and work through the implications. And
it's interesting you should mention that, Dr. Hamblin, because there's one lord who actually never took the oath Alexius wanted, and that's Raymond IV of Toulouse. And he's the one that, according to Anna, Alexius liked the most.
Right.
Yeah.
Anna thinks he's trustworthy, he's honorable. In fact, it's really what she says about him is really what does she say? Among the Latins, he shone like a star. So I've always found that fascinating. I mean, I know I've heard some people say that is more about anti-Bohemond propaganda. Like in hindsight, Anna was trying to portray Raymond as the anti-Bohemond. Like, this is what a Latin lord should be like. But we do know that Raymond and Alexius continued to have a good relationship pretty much throughout until Raymond's death.
Yeah, I think too, Alexius gets an allegiance of sorts from Raymond, even though he doesn't require the oath. And that's because he trusted Raymond. He if he has this trust in him, then a lesser allegiance is acceptable. It's the guys he doesn't trust that he needs the oaths from.
Yeah. And then I think we should also keep in mind that a lot of the Crusaders wanted a promise from Alexius. They wanted Alexius to help them. They wanted him to promise that he was going to help them in this military enterprise, that he was going to provide aid as they continue on to the Holy Land. And there are even some Crusaders who expected Alexius to actually lead them. Like, he would actually be the leader of this expedition. He would set out with this large army and sort of lead them to victory, if you will.
Yeah, part of that is the different conceptions of what a lord should be. In the West, the lord is you have a personal relationship with that lord, and you serve with him as an individual person. Whereas in the East, the emperor is this exalted figure who commands, and he sends out his generals or ambassadors or governors, and they do his will. So the Crusaders were expecting Alexius to behave like a Western lord to whom they took a vassalage vow, whereas Alexius was expecting to behave like a Byzantine emperor who doesn't need to personally do these things. He can simply command, and his armies, his generals will do what he says. So there's a very profound cultural difference in the way leadership was conceived of and kingship was conceived of.
Yeah. Okay, who's next? Anybody have anything else to add at this point?
Well, I was just going to say that Raymond was the one leader who remained loyal to Alexius. I know we're getting ahead here, but on into the situation at Antioch between Raymond and Bohemond after all was said and done, and they were trying to move on.
Yeah, that's true. And Raymond basically maintained his vassal type relationship with Alexius while he was besieging Tripoli. This is well after the First Crusade, but so that's kind of interesting. The county of Tripoli was kind of founded as a Byzantine vassal state, loosely, I guess, we could say, but interesting. So yeah, this all happens. These armies reached Constantinople between November of 1096 and May of 1097. So that just shows how long this is going on. Godfrey and some of those guys are coming closer to the beginning, and then Raymond actually is one of the last to show up towards the end there. Godfrey is going to cross the Bosphorus in February of 1097, so he's going to continue on. And so, as we're saying, one by one, these different armies are passing through, and oaths are being taken. And what happens is they proceed on to Nicaea, which is the city closest to Constantinople that is held by the Seljuk Turks, this kind of shows us the extent of what had happened after the Battle of Manzikert. The Seljuks basically control all of Anatolia at this point. And so Nicaea, which is this ancient Christian city, this is one of the founding cities of Christendom. It's probably a city that a lot of the Latins would have been familiar with from Scripture and that sort of thing. So this is the first major military action, if you will, of the First Crusade, the Siege of Nicaea, which begins in May of 1097.
Stephen,
yes,
do you think Nicaea would have been considered as much as a Christian holy place at that time, or just a revered place? Well,
to
what level? I know, the Nicene Creed. It was the site of preaching and the times after Christ, and
I think that like a lot of these places that the First Crusade passes through, these are the oldest places in Christendom.
Yeah,
and yeah, I mean,
how much of an importance did that?
Well,
assume in the mentality of the Crusaders. I mean,
I think it would have been,
Hamlin,
yeah, I think at Nicaea, as far as its reputation amongst Christendom, I don't think it would have been that big of a deal, but it would have been their first taste into, they're starting to get into places where Christianity really truly began, and they're going to be going through Anatolia, where cities, where there were Christian communities that, St. Paul had written letters to, and things like that they would have all been familiar with, due to the Mass and the liturgy, that they had back in the West. So I think it would have been kind of their first taste of, hey, we're getting back into the birthplace of our entire faith.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is, what level of importance would these cities have taken in the average Crusader's mind? I mean, so, someone who's literate or
well, the chroniclers mention it, don't they? I mean, like if you read the chronicles, when they get to a place like Nicaea, they'll kind of give the historical significance of it.
Yeah.
I think there's.
Go ahead.
And I'm speaking in a spiritual, the way of a spiritual significance. How much importance do they attach to it in those terms? I mean, say as compared to Jerusalem.
If you look at spirituality in medieval times, it's much more focused on saints and holy places that are sanctified by a saint of some sort. Like Rome is because of Peter and Paul, not because it was Rome.
Yeah.
And Nicaea certainly had saints there. I'm not sure who they were, but they would have had a cult associated with Byzantine Greek Orthodox religion. I don't think many Westerners would have known, Saint whoever of Nicaea. Instead, they have Santiago of Compostela in Spain, and they have various saints that are prominent in the West. When you get to New Testament sites, they are all associated with the New Testament figures. So Nicaea is kind of in between those.
Right.
It doesn't have the sanctity of Jesus and New Testament, doesn't have the sanctity of a Western saint like Peter and Paul in Rome, but does have a holiness of sorts. But I think it's lesser than these other two categories.
I would say to piggyback off of Professor Hamlin, I would say that whatever spiritual significance the Latins may have felt for Nicaea, it was probably vastly overshadowed by the territorial and cultural and probably religious as well significance that the Byzantine Greeks had for it.
Yeah.
I think
if you look at the way they talk about the cities, Antioch is very important to them because it's associations with Peter. Mm-hmm. Whereas Nicaea has no direct, it has indirect later Christian significance, but not directly in New Testament sense. And I think
really the most.
I think Constantinople would have been more significant to the Crusaders because of all the relics they're associated with saints, but also like the true cross or pieces of the cross and the crown of thorns and all sorts of things that they said they had there. So Nicaea would have been a kind of a third tier sacred site below New Testament and below
Dr. Hamlin.
Yes.
Getting ahead a little bit though, the original Holy Lance was supposed to be in Constantinople. Is that correct?
Well,
and that was part of the dispute that arose at Antioch.
Yes, there's a problem with a lot of the relics that they had in that sometimes there were multiple relics. Like I personally have seen 3 or 4 heads of John the Baptist.
Right.
Which I don't think he was.
I think they were all over the place.
So there was a level of popular spirituality in which you just believe in these relics or holy things. And then there is a kind of a critical spirituality of the educated, the clergy, other groups where they are dubious and wonder about these and reject some of the miracles or some of the saints or some of the relics.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it would vary quite a lot among the different groups. And I think the Orthodox had a different way of viewing these things than the Catholics as well.
So let's jump into the actual military action of the Siege of Nicaea. Dr. Hamlin, did you want to talk a little bit about what happens when the Crusaders actually besiege Nicaea?
Well, Nicaea is an important city for the Turks because it's the capital of Kılıç Arslan's domain. When we look at what is going on in Anatolia when the Crusaders come through, we need to understand that it was fragmented into a whole bunch of different principalities. Some of them run by Turks, some of them run by Armenians, and then a few still in the hands of the Byzantines. Kılıç Arslan was a Selçuk Turk, but he was of a kind of a side branch. He was not related to the directly a descendant of the great Selçuks who were in Mesopotamia and Syria. His branch came through a different brother of the sons of Selçuk originally, and so he was a much less powerful lord, and he had various political issues with the great Selçuks of Syria and Mesopotamia. But there was a Turkish lord called Shaka who lived in Smyrna. There was Danishmend who lived in kind of north central Anatolia, and then in eastern Anatolia there were other Turkish lords. So the first thing to note is Kılıç Arslan is not the lord of all the Turks. He is the lord of one branch of Turks who live in kind of central western Anatolia. Nicaea was an important city for him, and he was basically caught off guard because when the Crusaders to step one step back, when the People's Crusade came, he was able to crush that fairly easily. And so he probably had a view of the Crusaders as not a major threat. Now they come with a more professional army with 2 or 3 times the number of people that were in the People's Crusade, and the military situation shifts dramatically. When they cross, Kılıç Arslan is out in the east of Anatolia fighting the Danishmendids over a city called Melitene, which was an important town in kind of eastern Turkey. He's fighting this battle out there, and or rather campaign, and he gets a message that the Crusaders have come. So he tries to resolve that situation, not to his advantage, but tries to get out, and he moves back to Nicaea. But by the time he gets there, the Crusaders have already managed to cross over and basically start surrounding the city. That enough for now?
Yeah, that's good. So, Rand, what do you think?
Well, in a lot of ways, Nicaea, Nicaea is the Crusaders. It's their baptism under fire. This is their first real contact, with the enemy that they're going to be facing for quite a while. In fact, all the way through Antioch. They'll be facing the various tribes of the Turkic peoples. But at the same time, Nicaea, for a first contact, Nicaea is very tame. It's not. There's never any. The Crusaders, just sheer numbers wise, were probably more than enough to handle anything that they encountered there in Nicaea, to include a relief force sent by Kılıç Arslan himself there near the end.
On May 16th, right?
Of the siege, yes.
Yeah.
So I don't think there was any. It was probably it probably wasn't as much of a foretaste of coming events as maybe ideally it should have been. And also, a siege is a siege. If there was one very consistent set of tactics that the Western Latins were going to face, it was going to be a siege. In a siege, everybody knows where the other is. They're in there and we're out here, and it's usually a contest of attrition. Waiting the other out, seeing who can wait the longest, or on the off chance that they try to stage assaults. Everybody knows where the other's going to be. There's very few surprises with a siege scenario. So what's really important about Nicaea is what happens at the conclusion of it. And hopefully I'm not jumping ahead, but
no.
During the siege, the siege ends with after the relief force is beaten off. The Turkish garrison, obviously knows that the gig is up, and and that resistance at this point is going to be futile, and so they reach out to the Byzantine forces that were in the area, and they negotiate a surrender separate from the Latin Crusaders. And in fact, the Latin Crusaders aren't even involved in the discussion. Mm-hmm. And so the Crusaders, the chroniclers talk about the Crusaders, in the morning they see Byzantine banners flying from the towers, and I think this is kind of the first of several events that is going to contribute to the deterioration of Latin Byzantine relations throughout the First Crusade. There were a lot within the Crusader camp who felt cheated. They felt like the Byzantines had gone behind their backs, and that they were denied their, what was seen as their rightful, their rights to things like plunder and loot within the city. Now, something that has to be said, because you always get the thing that warfare back then, everybody was just out in it for greed, and they would plunder and loot and everything like that. Well, you got to remember, this is in the days before modern nation and arms states that that maintain armies at the expense of the state purse. Armies in the early Middle Age and the early medieval period were not paid. Or very few were, other than maybe small bands of extremely professional mercenaries. There was no contractual agreement, of a forthcoming salary for each man. Plunder and loot was the way that armies were paid. It's how they got something for their trouble, essentially. And for them to feel like as if they were denied the loot that they needed to in order to pay their men, that was a big deal, and that was very much seen as sort of a breach of good faith with their Byzantine sponsors. So it's very interesting to read that shortly after, Emperor Alexius very quickly arranges for gifts and money and things of that to be brought to Nicaea, and distributed amongst the Latin Crusaders. But still, the wound had been made. The poor first impression had already been made, and you have some chroniclers like the Anonymous in the Gesta Francorum, who also raises concerns about things like the Byzantines, because of as one of the terms of the surrender, the Turkish garrison is allowed to depart unmolested, and the Anonymous makes a note in his chronicle that that concerned him a lot, because he was worried that these were men that they were just going to have to face again, on their route to Anatolia. So there were a couple of things that were done that definitely contribute to the future deterioration of Latin Byzantine relations as this crusade progresses.
Let me just step back and take a look at the actual course of the siege.
Mm-hmm.
Nicaea was a huge town by medieval Western standards, and it was strongly fortified. There were old Roman fortifications that had been built, 1,000 years earlier, and then additions and repairs done in Byzantine style. And this was probably bigger than any city the Crusaders had seen in the West, except maybe Rome or a few other places like that. And it had stronger fortifications than most what they had seen in the West. So this was a big shock in some ways. The Crusaders surround the city on land, but they have a big problem, and that is a fourth to a third of the city rests up against a lake, which is fortified, but they have no way to assault that part or to prevent supplies from getting through. So for the first few weeks, the Turks are able to bring in messages and supplies and perhaps reinforcements by sea, because this is a pretty big lake. There's no way to surround it all with their men and prevent that. The way they solve that problem is that Alexius orders some of his navy to transport boats, probably light boats, over land, put them in the lake, and then sail up to the city with Byzantine troops in these ships, and basically cutting off supplies for the Turks. The Crusaders, in the meanwhile, are trying all sorts of ways to assault the city, but they're not very effective because of the size and strength of the fortifications. They partly bring down a tower, but the Turks are able to rebuild that strongly, and so they're having trouble figuring out a way to assault the city. But once it is cut off once the lake access is cut off, the Turks inside realize that in the long run, one way or another, they're going to lose. And so they surrender. I think one other thing to note from the Turkish perspective is that cities are not what's important. What's important is having the tribe free and having access to pasture for that tribe. Now, cities are important in a secondary sense, but Kılıç Arslan would rather have all of his nomadic horse archers as a force in standing somewhere in Anatolia and lose Nicaea rather than lose half of his horse archers and save Nicaea. So
Right.
from the nomad perspective, cities are less important than horses. And so you'll see that the Turks in Anatolia are willing to, or are less willing to go into long sieges than those in Syria, where they have no longer really a nomadic society, but the great Seljuks have merged in with Islamic society as a whole and have a much more urban-based military system.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too that leads to the surrender is that Kili Arslan's relief force is defeated at this battle on May 16th, and that's kind of an interesting moment because this is going to be the first time that the Crusaders are able to use their cavalry charge against the Turks, and it's effective because the positioning of the lake and everything actually allows them to target Kili Arslan's cavalry without them being able to scatter like they normally do. And I know some of the sources talk about how there's some strategy that goes into that to position the cavalry in such a way that they're able to make a direct hit on the Turks. So that's an important thing, and that's the episode in which they behead a bunch of Turks and then toss the heads into the city, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's kind of a big psychological blow to the garrison inside Nicaea when a bunch of their comrades' heads come flying into the city. So
well, and it's actually kind of an important little footnote to, I think that way more so than the Crusaders getting an idea of who they're fighting at Nicaea. I think what really happened at Nicaea was the Turks, especially Kili Arslan, realized that he was not fighting. He was not up against another band of rabble,
Peter the Hermit,
like with the People's Crusade. That this was a very professional, very well led, very numerous Western force that was going to be a serious. It was going to require an actual, a very serious response, and I think you see that, as they march on towards Dorylaeum.
Yeah.
I think one other thing to note is that Kili Arslan's goal when he brought his army up and attacked the Crusaders was not to destroy the Crusader army, because he probably recognized he was outnumbered quite a bit. His goal was to get troops inside the city.
Right.
That is to break through. It was the Provençal French that were on the south end. He wanted to break through their line and get into the gate and reinforce the city with more troops. So he probably, once that failed, he basically says, I'll hang around. I'll keep my army in standing here around the area. But he does not make another attempt to actually attack the Crusaders. So, you have to look at it from his perspective of what his goal was in that battle. And it fails, but, I don't think he was aiming at a complete victory at that moment.
Right. And then just to jump back to some of what you were saying earlier, Rand, it's definitely true that we get from some of the chroniclers this idea that they felt, cheated by the way things turned out with Alexius's truce or his terms that he comes to with the garrison inside of Nicaea. But I remember when I was reading Thomas Asbridge's book about the First Crusade, he kind of pointed out that sometimes that is overemphasized because some of the chroniclers, like for example, Fulcher of Chartres, does not really take that attitude that, oh, well, we were cheated by Alexius. Yeah. And that in fact, from the perspective of that might be more of like a perspective from some of the common soldiers, but from a lot of the nobility, from the perspective of a lot of the leadership of the Crusade, Asbridge argued that really Nicaea should be viewed as a pretty seamless cooperative effort between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. That's just kind of interesting.
Possibly was, yeah, and I would say that it's always important to look at the sources that are mentioning it. In particular, I mentioned the anonymous, with his Gesta Francorum. The anonymous most likely was, in fact, he's probably one of the best sources for kind of the attitudes of the more common soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
In that, he most likely was he was either a very minor knight, or he was potentially even a non-combatant. He was potentially there's some rumors that he was a cleric of some sort, like a minor cleric of some sort. One thing that I think has to be taken into account is even to this day in the military, we talk about perception as reality. And I think amongst the common men, there was sort of this perception that the Byzantines had gone behind their backs, that there was already sort of this breach of trust, and yes, the better educated, better informed leadership probably didn't all feel that way. Although I'm sure there were some who chafed amongst the Italian Norman contingent. Just because of their attitudes to the Byzantines from the get-go. It's interesting to see, especially amongst the chroniclers that seem to be a little bit more in tune with sort of the common fighters,
right?
That there was very much that perception that that there was a clear breach of trust, and that the Byzantines didn't fully trust the Crusaders, and that was the beginnings of a perception that was gonna shadow the Crusade from that point on.
I get the impression that Alexius was rather stingy with the common men.
Well, I mean, possibly, but again, I think it's more like what Professor Hamlin talked about, in that it was kind of the cultural differences between the way things were done in the West and the way things were done in the Eastern Greek world. The Byzantines were still coming; they were still kind of adhering to, although it had evolved significantly since this time, but they were still kind of adhering to the old Roman tradition of the legions that fought for the emperor, and things like that. It wasn't, there wasn't as much of a personal obligation to.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's a matter of perception.
Yeah.
Sure.
From Alexius' perspective, if he gives gifts to the princes, he's expecting them to take care of their people. Whereas it's not his job to give money to the low-level guys. A gift to the princes is a gift to the entire group. I think
the low-level guys, of whom there were quite a few, felt cheated.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, Fulcher of Chartres says specifically that the foot soldiers were given. He says they were distributed copper coins, which they call tartarons.
Yeah,
what he says. So, I mean, I think it really depends on the chronicler. Fulcher of Chartres, he is very positive about Alexius through most of his chronicle, and basically he describes what happens at Nicaea as just this like big smashing, brotherly victory. It's like we took him down, and Alexius took care of everybody, and it was great. Whereas, like you're saying, Rand, the Gesta Francorum and even Count Raymond's chaplain both kind of have this attitude of, oh, we were cheated out of plundering Nicaea.
Yeah,
I think there's another thing we need to take a look at, and that is that a lot of the chroniclers are writing several years after these events and are criticizing Alexius because, in fact, at Antioch they don't give the city back to Alexius, which what they had vowed to do, and so to justify their breaking of that vow, they have to make him a breaker of his vows, which they do. I mean, they describe this in several different ways, that he doesn't fulfill his obligations to the army. One last thing to note is that there are 2 letters written from Nicaea that survive, and they both praise Alexius for his generosity. So, and those were written within weeks of the siege. So from there, but they are noblemen writing that, not the common people. But so there is this shift in perception of, is Alexius a good guy who's on our side, to Alexius is the oath breaker who doesn't come to the rescue of the Crusaders type of a thing. And that justifies our keeping Antioch rather than giving it back to him.
Yeah, good points. Good points all around. So do we have anything else we want to say about the acquirement of Nicaea, or do we want to go ahead and move on to the Battle of Dorylaeum?
Push.
Ready to go? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, Nicaea is acquired by the Crusaders, and from a Byzantine perspective, this is almost the most important thing that happens in the First Crusade, because the acquirement of Nicaea is actually going to lead to Alexius being able to retake a lot of other portions of Anatolia. But for the Crusaders, they're going to continue on with this long march across the rather barren and blisteringly hot Asia Minor. So this is kind of one of the big trials of the First Crusade, if you will, because it's the height of summer, and they're marching across this territory. And I've actually been to some of these parts of Turkey today, and it does get incredibly hot in the summer, and it's dry, and it is some rough territory. So, Dr. Hamblin, do you want to talk a little bit about this march away from Nicaea leading up to Dorylaeum?
Well, the armies, once Nicaea is secure, the armies take a few days to rest and resupply and get ready, and then they march off, and they basically have to pick the road, and they have with them a guy named Tacticios, who is actually a Turk who his father was a slave of Alexius, and he's kind of a personal semi-slave or courtier of Alexius. And he advises them on the routes to take and where there might be water and things like that. So they have this Byzantine guide and maybe a couple thousand Byzantine troops going with them, and they make a plan of what route to take. And the route they take goes through this place called Dorylaeum, which it was a old fortress which had more or less been abandoned because of the Turkish wars. Their big problem is, as usual, logistics. That is to say, now they've got maybe 40 or 50,000 people. How do you feed them, and how do you find water for them all? And in addition to that, you've got all these horses, probably 20, 30,000 pack animals and horses. And the horses are very important, because the easiest way to stop a knight is to take his horse. And if the horses run out of fodder and they run out of water, they could get sick and die just like the humans. And so they have this logistical problem, which forces them to split their army into 2 groups. And the thought being that if you camp with a limited water supply, more people can have access to that water. If you only have to get water for 20,000 people, it takes less time than everybody at the well all wanting water at exactly the same moment. So by splitting it up, you are relieving some of the logistical problems. Although the army that's in the rear tends to have less pasture, and all the food, any food that's available has already been taken by the army that's in the front. So it does create a different set of problems. But at any rate, they divide in 2 and start marching down the road. They get a couple days down the road, and all the time they have been shadowed by the Turks. Kılıç Arslan still has his army. It was not destroyed at Nicaea. He has reinforcements of probably a couple thousand garrison troops that were freed from Nicaea, that probably makes up whatever losses he had at his battle that he fought at Nicaea. And so his army is still pretty strong. but it's not strong enough to attack all the Crusaders at once. So this creates the tactical problem for the Crusaders. When we're together, we're stronger militarily, but we have a logistical mess. When we're separate, we're weaker militarily, but our logistics are alleviated. Logistic is alleviated to some degree. So Kılıç Arslan is shadowing the Crusaders, and he's looking for a good moment to try to hit them while they're separate. And he picks this spot. Exactly where it was is not clear. France, in his Victory in the East book, makes a case for a place where two streams meet together, maybe a day from Dorylaeum. It may have been closer. There's debate about this. But basically, the Bohemond's group goes first with Robert of Normandy. They start out, they camp at a place. In the morning, they're getting up, getting ready to go, and that's when the Turks decide to attack. And they basically come in from all directions. Their goal is, number one, never attack a formed shield wall. You'll never see Turks doing that. And number two, harass whatever troops there are until they start to break. And then when they break, when they start to run and scatter and so forth, then you move in and attack them. But when they're formed in strong formations, you never attack strength, you attack weakness, and you harass until weakness is manifest. And so the Turks move in, they surround the Crusaders, they're attacking them from many directions. The Crusaders are protected in part by camp gear, that they make barricades. Partly they form a shield wall. The knights, for the most part, dismount and are working with the army. Bohemond is essentially the military leader and is able to keep the spirits up. They're at a marshy stream where there's water, and the women and civilians are bringing water to the soldiers, because in the middle of July on the Turkish plateau, it's probably 100 degrees, 90, in that range. And when you are in a suit of armor and are fighting constantly, you're losing tons of water, and that armor basically gets baked. It's like being in an oven. And so the access to water at Dorylaeum is probably the key reason why they succeeded. They didn't break up. Bohemond's leadership is probably the second reason. That Bohemond was able to keep the Crusaders in a tight formation that the Turks did not want to attack directly, but attack indirectly through archery assaults. So I'll stop there, let somebody pick up the story from then on. But basically up to that point, it had been 3 or 4 or 5 hours of constant harassment by the Turks, who are shooting. We need to understand, each Turk probably had 20 to 40 arrows. And if there's 10,000 Turks, that's 20, 30,000 arrows being shot at the Crusaders. Now, most of those will hit shields and, will miss, but all you have to do is get 1 out of 20 arrows to hit, and you've got at least wounds. Probably not going to kill the guys unless the range is pretty short, but you will cause cuts, bruises, wounds, and causing trouble in that regard. So that was the Turkish goal, but it doesn't quite work out the way they want. So let somebody else pick it up.
I have one question.
Oh, sorry,
Dr. Hamblin.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, when the Turks attacked, Bohemond's and Robert's forces were already completely encamped. Is that correct?
My understanding is they were breaking camp. So they had camped there at the night. Okay. And the goal was the Turks attacked them before they had organized themselves into a marching order that could be used as some type of military defense. So the goal was to hit them while they were disorganized, breaking camp.
But they hadn't broken enough to
no, they were not
prevent them from reforming and forming a defensive barrier.
I think probably some of them were on the road. That is, when these armies are camped, the guys who get ready, they start moving out, and other guys who are taking longer, slept in or sick or whatever, that takes them longer. And so it was ambiguous in that regard. That's my understanding. So, the army led by Raymond and Adhemar of Le Puy was
what, half a day behind?
And Godfrey.
Godfrey, yeah.
It was probably something
Godfrey,
like that. Yeah, it was probably something like that. But Bohemund sends messengers off immediately when the attack occurs, and they manage to get through the Turks. And my suspicion is that all of the cavalry of the Second Army of Raymond's army and Ademar's army, they move forward as quickly as they can with the infantry coming up as fast as they can, but they're going to be left behind by the time they reach Bohemund's force. The infantry will be behind further, I think.
All right.
I was just going to say that I have this little passage from Fulcher of Chartres where he actually described, he was with that group that was with Bohemund because he was following Robert of Normandy. And he says, what shall I say next? We were all indeed huddled together like sheep in a fold, trembling and frightened, surrounded on all sides by enemies so that we could not turn in any direction. So that kind of gives us an idea of, how that they were very confined. But part of the reason for that was, as Dr. Hamlin was pointing out, is that Bohemund was able to effectively maintain this formation that kept them alive.
I actually have a lot to say about this. This is one of the reasons I was wanting to be on this podcast, because Dorylaeum is just from a tactical perspective, it's just a super rich topic. One of the most important things about Dorylaeum, and Dr. John France does a phenomenal breakdown of this battle using the sources that kind of contradicts a lot of popular perceptions about it. First off, the marching order of them being in separate columns like that, but still within contact with one another, still within reasonable contact, is actually an incredibly sound tactic. It's very similar to tactics that we in modern times still use to this day, and what we call movement to contact. And it was essentially a fighting marching order. It was a marching order that was ready to respond, but at the same time was maintaining a certain degree of mobility, with the lead element out front, sort of almost serving as a recon element. And you see this multiple times. You see this multiple times within engagements in that time. Also, it's telling that I think that Bohemund was the one put in charge of the lead element, as he was the one who, of all the Crusader lords out there, had prior experience fighting in the East. So I think they recognized even before Dorylaeum that Bohemund was going to be the ideal person to be in the lead element like that. When they actually settle in, you're right. They were sort of in a still in a camp, in a camp status, as it were. But there's a certain degree of reactivity that you sense within the chronicles that they seem to have been aware that something could happen at any time. The Crusaders definitely do not seem like they were completely taken by surprise when they passed through the pass north of Dorylaeum, where they were where Khalij was obviously trying to stage an ambush. It did not come to them as much of a surprise as I think Khalij was hoping for. And again, you see that had the Crusaders had that lead element not had Bowman's contingent of Italian Normans, and just his experience of what to deal with when it came to fighting the Turks, I don't think they would have fared as well. And there's many other scholars who agree with that. The fact that he had the more heavily armored knights dismount, to prevent any knights from being lost by pursuing Turkish archers, Turkish horse archers, which is exactly what they wanted them to do. The fact that they hardened up, they formed ranks. They almost formed sort of a semi-square. With John France talks about in the space that he's pretty sure is the battlefield. He talks about there being a kind of a marsh and kind of a marshy area off to their left or off to their right. That would have additionally helped shield them from a mounted force. The point of the battle was to essentially line up, form up, and make the Turks come to them, which was not a situation that the Turks wanted to be in. The Turks were way better. They succeeded way more at pulling forces apart and making making them pursue them.
Hey, Rand.
So yeah,
didn't Bohemond have intelligence ahead of time that Kili Arslan was going to attack? I feel like I
do know there were some. I think I can't remember which chronicler it is, but there were some. I think there were some spies captured, some Turkish spies or Turkish scouts that were captured beforehand. But at the same time, that's battlefield intelligence, and so he may have just had more of an instinct that the Turks were near and that they were going to hit at some point. He probably didn't know where. He probably didn't know exactly when. His tactical instinct probably would have been on edge that whole time. It's a fascinating tactical study in how they survived that conflict, and they talk about the sources talk about the first phase of the battle, this battle with the lead element, this dismounted lead element, lasting for a while. They talk about it lasting from early in the morning until about noon. So this went on for a while. Obviously, the Turks were probably they were just keeping up constant arrow fire as much as they could, and the chronicles talk about a lot of people within the center of the square, especially the more poorly, the more poor foot soldiers and the poorly equipped, comprising the majority of the casualties. They were obviously in almost kind of an Alamo situation where they were just hoping to hold until the much larger, much more powerful second element made it to them. And that's really where you see the battle turn, is once the second element comes, the Turks, they probably exhausted the majority of their ammunition. The chronicles talk about that they were actually starting to try and melee, trying to enter into melee, which they were obviously going to lose. They were obviously at a disadvantage with the much more heavily armed and armored Western knights. And then, once they're sort of pinned and preoccupied with the lead element, then the following element comes in and is able to execute, their devastating charges against a Turkish force that can't really escape, that's lost a lot of its mobility, while trying to deal with this square. So the Battle of Dorylaeum is a fascinating tactical event, and I see it more, and I know some others, to include Dr. France, see it this way. It was sort of the Crusaders' real sort of first experience with with legitimate combat in the East, and what they are going to be facing all the way up to Jerusalem itself. So it's kind of their, while Nicaea may have been their first contact, Dorylaeum is sort of their real first. It's their real first pitched engagement, where they in a lot of ways, due to a lot of factors that had they not had, it probably wouldn't have ended up as successful as it was.
All right, thanks for that, Rand. I knew you were going to have some interesting comments on the Battle of Dorylaeum, so I appreciate that. Yeah, fascinating stuff. I'm sorry?
I said, hopefully I didn't go too long on that.
No, good stuff. Does anybody else have any other comments about the Battle of Dorylaeum?
Just a quick comment. The Turkish tactics worked at Kivitot when they wiped out the People's Crusade, and they worked at Manzikert in 1071. So what they do, their tactics against heavily armed formed troops can work. On the other hand, sometimes they fail. So in this case, it failed, and the Turks essentially, when the cavalry from the second group attack, the Turks just scatter. I mean, they take off and they don't even try to stop the new group. That is, they realize they failed in their goal, which was to break the formation. If the formation's not broken, there's no reason to stay around and fight these heavy knights. So they just flee in every direction they can go.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, the way I understand it is, if you take the bait that the Turks offer, then you very likely are going to have your force destroyed by them, because what they're wanting is, like you're saying, Rand, is they want a few guys to take off after them, and then of course they just vanish, and then they swarm back in and just pummel you with arrows. But Bohemund's organization of the forces in this case really carried the day, and this is kind of the first time we see Bohemund. Bohemund's going to be kind of the star of the First Crusade from here on until Antioch.
He really does. He really does come out as sort of the the MVP of the moment. It was obviously something that he had experience with. It was obviously something that he was prepared for. And I think it wasn't just him. I think he had his whole Italo-Norman contingent with him. These were obviously probably, I mean, the Italo-Normans at this stage of history, they were kind of the military rock stars of their age. They had a ferocious reputation, all across the West and even into the Byzantine East. They had a reputation for professionalism, for discipline, there was very few things that they couldn't take on, I think that's what really made the difference there. Was unlike other forces that the Turks had encountered up until that time, especially the People's Crusade, this was a very disciplined, very experienced force that was able to match them man for man, it really came down to superior discipline carried the day. So
yeah, good comments. Bowman's obviously very impressive here. I also read a while back a book called The Conqueror's Son by Catherine Lack. And it's about Robert II Curthose of Normandy. And have any of you ever read that book?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it, unfortunately.
No.
She kind of argues that Robert Curthose kind of doesn't get the recognition he deserves during the First Crusade. And I remember one of the points she mentions is that Curthose actually conducted himself pretty well at the Battle of Dorylaeum as well.
I would absolutely agree with that. In fact, you get little hints of that through some of the sources, especially from the Anonymous, the Gesta Francorum. Robert comes out very positive in this, which is funny, because for the most part throughout the Crusade, he ends up kind of having sort of a mixed reputation, and he kind of has a mixed reputation even beyond the Crusade. He was, there's always the famous story of him, in Normandy, where he had to stay in bed all day because and he had to miss out on a sermon from a visiting bishop because he spent the night prior, carousing with friends and whores, and they stole all his clothes, and so he, there was definitely a negative side to his personality that was always kind of portrayed popularly. But I think militarily, again, like the title of the book suggests, this was the son of perhaps one of the most famous military leaders of that entire generation. William of Normandy was I mean, he was a legend before he even died. All across Europe, and he was also distantly related to another extremely famous Norman military figure, and that was Robert Guiscard, who went down south to Italy, and whose son Boland was now represented at Dorylaeum. So there were two very potent military legacies on the field in that engagement, and it makes you wonder. I think through the sources you're able to determine that Robert of Normandy and his Franco-Normans, they commanded one of the sides of that open square formation, and you have to think that amount of military skill, or at least the legacy of that military skill present on that field had to have counted for something, and I think it very much did.
I think it's worth noting that in some ways, Bohemund and Robert are making a virtue of necessity, in the sense that if they had either sent their knights out to fight the Turks, that would have caused certain problems, because the Turks would have fled, the knights follow, and then the Turks surround the infantry alone. And if they marched the infantry and the knights out together, they would have left the camp to be plundered by the Turks. So they had no option, I think, no good option tactically, except to do what they did. And so, in a part, it is good military policy. On the other hand, there wasn't many options. And also, if those, when you read about Fulker cringing and being terrified, if the troops had not stayed with the camp would have been wiped out. I mean, these guys would have scattered in every direction, and it would have been a disaster, even if the army had been preserved. So, basically, they played their cards exactly right in this battle.
Yeah. Well, and something to also realize is that these following within these camps, it wasn't just they would have lost their tents and they would have lost their supplies. No, there were actually quite a bit of non-combatants who were in those camps. I mean, I'm sure quite a few of those men brought their families along. That was not uncommon in medieval warfare at all.
Right. Well, it talks about the women carrying water to the soldiers in the battle.
Exactly. So
there were women there.
They were fighting not just for their camp, not just for their supplies. They were fighting for potentially their own families that were there with them. And it really was some of the chronicles talk about that apparently there were non-combatant, there were camp followers that were kind of strung out between the two forces, and basically a lot of them just got wiped out. They do talk about a significant amount of casualties amongst the sort of the non-combatant camp followers during this engagement.
Yeah, that's in Fulker, I think. Okay, really good stuff, everybody. So that's kind of the Battle of Dorylaeum. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? I don't want to cut anybody off here.
All I have to add, and just throw out the question, was, was it a do or die thing? If it had been a total defeat of, for Bohemund and Robert, would that have been the end of the effort? What do you think, Dr. Hamblin?
I think
it's been a complete wipeout, everybody massacred, the whole thing.
I think in theory they could have, if Bohemund's force had been destroyed, a bunch of them would have survived just by running away and hiding and so forth. So everyone wouldn't have died. But the second army was still there, and it may have been probably larger than Bohemund's. And theoretically, they could have carried on. Now, whether their morale would have collapsed, you never know. But I don't think it necessarily would have been the end of the crusade. But I think that when they got to Antioch, if they'd had, had lost 5,000 men at Dorylaeum, if there'd been a wipeout, that might have been a high enough casualty rate to make Antioch fail. They just wouldn't have had enough men in the long run. So I think they could have carried on, but it may have ended up in the collapse of the Crusade in the long run.
Okay. Well, it just seems like Dorylaeum was such a pivotal battle. And
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, it really, just in my own opinion, it was just kind of the turning point. What kept them going on to Antioch.
All right. So yeah, I think that kind of brings us to the end of this podcast. Does anybody have anything else to add?
We'll see you next time.
Perfect. And I'm just going to suggest, if it's okay with everybody else, we just do this same live format for next Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. Central Time. Does that work with everybody?
That's fine with me.
That works for me.
Fine.
Excellent. So everybody out there listening, just tune in next Tuesday, and we'll be doing this again from 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time until whenever we're done, maybe 8:30. So yeah, really, really great discussion here, guys. I enjoyed it. I think we had a good group. Dr. Hamblin, on behalf of all three of us, I want to say thanks so much for being our academic guest this evening.
My pleasure.
And let's go ahead and just give a plug for Dr. Hamblin's online presence. He's got an excellent YouTube channel called Crusading Warfare, and you also have a website, Dr. Hamblin, called, is it crusadingwarfare.net?
Yes, crusadingwarfare.net. And a Facebook group, Crusading Warfare. I'm very original with those names.
I've enjoyed your videos, Dr. Hamblin.
Oh, thanks.
You go into, a lot of detail.
Yeah, Dr. Hamblin's got some really good videos out.
Yeah, they're great.
He's sort of going through a long-term series, which is going to look at the military history of the Crusades to the Holy Land, basically. Am I right about that, Dr. Hamblin?
Yes. If I don't get bored,
right,
or change my mind. But that's the plan.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks very much, guys. This is Real Crusades History. We do a new podcast or video every Monday. And of course, now we're going to be doing this on Tuesdays until the end of this series. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. Also, of course, our YouTube channel, the thing that started all this, youtube.com/Real Crusades History. Of course, you're on it right now if you're listening to this. And we will talk with you next time. And I'm going to stop the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.